The flames climbed higher into the Montana sky as Marcus watched 15 years of his life disappear into smoke and ash. Standing barefoot in the snow, clutching only the shirt on his back, he had lost everything. His home, his workshop, his father's tools, every possession that anchored him to this remote mountain ridge. But what happened next would prove that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding what you never knew you needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thorne had built his life around solitude, high up on Copper Ridge, where the nearest neighbor lived 7 miles down a winding dirt road. He had carved out an existence that required no one and asked nothing of the world below. The log cabin he called home sat at 8,200 feet, surrounded by towering pines and granite outcroppings that seemed to touch the Montana sky. For 15 years, since his 23rd birthday, Marcus had lived this way. He repaired watches and clocks for collectors across the country, intricate work that arrived by mail and departed the same way. His workshop, attached to the main cabin, housed dozens of timepieces in various stages of restoration, grandfather clocks from the 1800s, pocket watches with mechanisms so delicate they required magnification to service, Swiss movements that demanded absolute precision. The work suited him. Each timepiece presented a puzzle to solve, mechanical mysteries that revealed themselves only through patient observation and skilled hands. He could spend hours studying the interplay of gears and springs, understanding how craftsmen from generations past had solved problems of accuracy and durability. There was honesty in this work, clarity in its purpose. A clock either kept time or it didn't. There were no gray areas, no complicated emotional variables to navigate. His father, Samuel Thorne, had taught him the trade before cancer took him when Marcus was 19. The workshop tools, precision screwdrivers, jeweler's loops, calibrated weights, had been Samuel's and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Thorne men had made their living coaxing life back into wounded timepieces. Marcus had simply chosen to do it in isolation, far from the complications that came with other people. The cabin itself reflected this philosophy of simple functionality. 2 rooms and a loft, built from logs Marcus had felled himself, chinked, with mud and stone from the creek that ran nearby. A fieldstone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney constructed with careful attention to drawer and efficiency. Solar panels on the south-facing roof powered his workshop equipment, and a small refrigerator. A wood-burning stove provided heat, and oil lamps offered light when the short mountain days surrendered to long winter nights. Outside, a small garden produced enough vegetables to supplement the venison he hunted and the trout he pulled from. Mountain streams, a root cellar carved into the hillside, kept food fresh through the harsh winters when snow might isolate him for weeks at a time. He owned a reliable truck for supply runs to Millerville, the closest town, but these expeditions happened infrequently, perhaps once a month during good weather, less often when winter locked the mountains in ice. This particular November morning had started like thousands of others. Marcus woke before dawn, stoked the fire that had burned low during the night, and brewed coffee from beans he ordered online. The ritual never varied. Coffee first, then a walk around the property to check for signs of wildlife or weather damage, followed by breakfast and the day's work in the shop. The workshop held 7 timepieces in various stages of repair. A 1920s loneliest pocket watch needed a new mainspring. A German mantel clock from the 1940s required complete movement cleaning. A railroad watch, its case worn smooth by decades in a conductor's pocket, awaited adjustment of its regulation mechanism. Each piece represented weeks of correspondence with its owner, careful negotiations about restoration methods and costs, detailed explanations of what could be preserved and what must be replaced. Marcus had been adjusting the escapement mechanism. On a particularly challenging piece, a French carriage clock with complications that included a lunar calendar, when he first noticed the smell, something acrid that didn't belong in the clean mountain air. He paused, listening for the sound of engines or voices that might explain the odor, but heard only the usual whisper of wind through pine boughs. Setting down his tools, he stepped outside to investigate. The smell was stronger here. Definitely. Smoke, but not the familiar wood smoke from his own chimney. This was different, sharp, chemical, with undertones that suggested burning materials other than seasoned timber. He scanned the visible ridges and valleys, but saw nothing obvious. No telltale column of smoke against the clear blue sky. Returning to his workbench, Marcus tried to focus on the delicate brass components spread before him. But concentration proved elusive. The smell persisted, growing stronger as the morning progressed. By 10 o'clock, he could no longer ignore the possibility that something was seriously wrong somewhere in his vicinity. He climbed to the cabin's roof, using handholds he had installed for maintenance access to the solar panels and chimney. From this vantage point, he could see most of the surrounding terrain, the network of ridges and draws that defined this section of the Rockies. At first, nothing appeared amiss. Then, looking southeast toward the valley where the old logging road wound toward distant Millerville, he spotted it, a thin column of smoke, almost invisible against the pale morning sky, rising from somewhere, in the direction of McReynolds' place. Tom and Janet McReynolds lived about 5 miles away, their property accessible by a rough track that branched off the main logging road. Marcus had met them only twice in 15 years, once when they had first moved to the mountains, seeking the same solitude he valued, and again 3 years later when Tom had helped him extract his truck from a particularly troublesome snowdrift. The McReynolds were good neighbors in the mountain sense, present when needed, absent otherwise. They respected boundaries and privacy, while remaining available for genuine emergencies. Tom raised a few head of cattle on his 40 acres, and Janet maintained a large vegetable garden that apparently produced enough surplus to supply half. The valley. They lived quietly, bothering no one, asking nothing beyond the occasional neighborly assistance that mountain living sometimes required. But that smoke column was growing thicker, darker, taking on the ominous characteristics of a structure fire rather than a controlled burn or casual brush clearing. Marcus watched for several minutes, hoping to see the smoke diminish or shift in ways that would suggest human control over whatever was burning. Instead, the column expanded, taking on an ugly brown cast that spoke of serious combustion involving materials that shouldn't be burning. The decision came quickly. Marcus grabbed his keys, threw on a heavy jacket, and headed for his truck. Whatever was happening at the McReynolds' place required immediate attention. In these remote mountains, emergency response came from neighbors, not distant fire departments. With response times measured in hours rather than minutes. The drive to the McReynolds' property took him down narrow, winding roads that switchbacked through dense forest. His truck, a reliable Ford that had served him faithfully for a decade, handled the rough terrain with familiar competence. As he descended from his ridge, the smoke became more visible, no longer a thin column, but a broad plume that suggested significant fire activity. Rounding the final bend before the McReynolds' driveway, Marcus saw the full scope of the disaster. Their house, a modest ranch-style structure they had built themselves over several summers, was fully involved in flames. The roof had already partially collapsed, sending showers of sparks into the surrounding trees. Tom's workshop, a separate building about 50 yards from the house, was also burning. Its contents, tools, machinery, stored lumber, adding fuel to the conflagration. Marcus pulled up to find Tom and Janet standing in their driveway, watching their home of 12 years disappear into smoke and flame. They were safe, apparently uninjured, but the devastation was complete. Nothing of the house would be salvageable. Even from a distance, Marcus could feel the intense heat radiating from the burning structure. "Marcus!" Tom called out, recognizing the truck. His voice carried a combination of relief at seeing a familiar face and grief over the loss unfolding before them. "Thank God you saw the smoke." "What happened?" Marcus asked, joining them at what appeared to be a safe distance from the flames. Janet answered, her voice steady despite obvious emotional strain. "Woke up to smoke in the bedroom around dawn. Chimney fire that got into the roof cavity somehow. By the time we got outside, the whole attic was going. Spread too fast to save anything." Tom nodded grimly. "Called 911 on the cell phone, but you know how long it takes them to get up here. Volunteer fire department's 40 minutes away on a good day. Nothing to do but watch it burn and make sure it doesn't spread to the forest." Marcus surveyed the scene with a growing understanding of their predicament. The McReynolds were in their mid-50s, both retired teachers who had invested their savings in this mountain property. The house represented not just their home, but their entire life's accumulation of possessions, memories, security. Insurance might eventually provide some compensation, but immediate needs, shelter, clothing, basic necessities, required immediate solutions. "You have somewhere to go?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer. "Sister in Denver," Janet replied. "But that's temporary at best. This was our retirement plan, our permanent home. We put everything into building this place." The three of them stood in silence, watching the flames consume what had taken years to build. Marcus found himself thinking about his own cabin, the tools and timepieces that represented his livelihood, the simple life he had constructed on his mountain ridge. The vulnerability was sobering. All of it could disappear as quickly as the McReynolds' home was disappearing now. As if reading his thoughts, Tom spoke quietly. 15 years we've been neighbors, Marcus. Never needed much from each other, but it was always good knowing you were up there on the ridge. Good people within shouting distance, even if the shouting had to carry for miles." The comment struck Marcus unexpectedly. He had always thought of his neighbors as distant presences, people who happened to live in the same general area, but whose lives rarely intersected with his own. Tom's words suggested a different perspective, that even his chosen isolation existed within a network of human connection, that his presence on Copper Ridge meant something to the people who shared these mountains with him. The volunteer fire department arrived an hour later, their pumper truck navigating the mountain roads with practiced skill. But by then, the house was gone, reduced to smoldering foundations and scattered debris. The firefighters worked methodically to ensure the blaze wouldn't spread to the surrounding forest, soaking the perimeter and checking for hotspots that might reignite. Captain Rodriguez, a weathered man who had been fighting mountain fires for 20 years, approached the small group after completing his initial assessment. "Total loss on the structures," he confirmed. "But you folks did the right thing staying back and calling it in. These mountain fires can get away from you fast." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He looked at Tom and Janet with professional sympathy. "The Red Cross will have a representative out tomorrow to talk about immediate assistance, clothing, temporary housing vouchers, that kind of thing. The insurance adjuster will want to see the site once it's cool enough for inspection." After the fire department departed, Marcus found himself reluctant to leave the McReynolds alone with the ruins of their life. The practical side of his mind pointed out that there was nothing he could do to change what had happened, that Tom and Janet were adults capable of managing their own crisis. But something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity that his years of solitude hadn't entirely suppressed, kept him from simply offering condolences and driving away. "Janet mentioned Denver," he said carefully. "That's a long way from here." Tom sighed. Janet's sister has a guest room. Kind of her to offer, but we can't impose indefinitely. And frankly, after 12 years up here, the thought of going back to city life, he shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. There are rental options in Millerville, Marcus suggested, though he knew the mountain town's housing market was limited and expensive. On a teacher's pension. Janet laughed, but without humor. We'll figure something out. Always do. The conversation felt inadequate, polite exchanges that touched only the surface of a life-altering catastrophe. Marcus recognized his own limitations in situations requiring emotional intelligence or social skills. His chosen isolation had preserved him from many complications, but it had also left him unprepared for moments when human connection became essential. Driving back to his cabin as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the mountain landscape. Marcus found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Tom's comment about good people within shouting distance. The phrase suggested a definition of community he had never considered, not the intrusive, demanding relationships he had fled by moving to the mountains, but a network of mutual awareness and potential support that existed without requiring daily interaction or emotional intimacy. His own cabin, when he reached it, felt different somehow. The familiar rooms, the workshop with its precision tools, the simple routines that had provided satisfaction for 15 years, all of it remained exactly as he had left it, yet something had shifted in his perception. The solitude he had cultivated so carefully now felt less like independence and more like disconnection from the human community that existed even in these remote mountains. That evening, as Marcus worked by lamplight on the French carriage clock, he found his concentration fractured by images from the day, the McReynolds standing in their driveway, watching their life burn, Tom's comment about good neighbors within shouting distance, Janet's steady voice masking obvious grief over lost possessions and displaced dreams. The clock's mechanism, spread in precise order across his workbench, represented the kind of problem Marcus understood intuitively. Each component had a specific function. Each movement served a clear purpose in the larger mechanism. When something went wrong, careful observation and skilled intervention could restore proper function. The relationships between parts were logical, predictable, subject to physical laws that could be mastered through study and practice. Human relationships, he was beginning to understand, operated according to different principles entirely. The bonds that connected people in communities, even remote mountain communities, were less visible than clockwork, but perhaps more essential. Tom and Janet had lost their physical possessions in the fire, but they had also lost their place in the informal network of mutual support that existed among the scattered residents of these mountains. As he carefully adjusted the clock's escapement mechanism, Marcus found himself wondering about the other neighbors he had barely acknowledged in 15 years of mountain living. The Kowalski family, who ran a small sawmill in the valley below his ridge. Bill Morrison, the retired forest ranger who lived alone in a converted fire lookout tower. The Hendersons, who raised sheep on a high meadow about 10 miles north of his property. He had encountered each of them occasionally over the years, brief conversations at the post office in Millerville, nods of recognition at the hardware store, the kind of minimal social interaction that acknowledged shared residence in a sparsely populated region without requiring deeper engagement. But Tom's words suggested these minimal connections represented something more significant than Marcus had recognized. The thought was both unsettling and intriguing. Unsettling because it implied that his carefully constructed independence was, perhaps, less complete than he had believed. Intriguing because it suggested possibilities for human connection that didn't require the emotional complications he had spent 15 years avoiding. Outside his cabin, the mountain night settled with its familiar sounds, wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creek running over stones in its bed. These sounds had provided him with a sense of place and belonging for 15 years. But tonight, for the first time, Marcus found himself listening for something more. Some indication that he was part of a larger community, even if that community was scattered across dozens of mountain miles. The French carriage clock ticked steadily on his workbench, its newly adjusted mechanism keeping perfect time. Each second marked precisely, each hour divided into predictable segments, the entire mechanism working in harmony to fulfill its singular purpose. Marcus had restored its function, solved its mechanical puzzle, returned it to useful life. But as he prepared for bed that night, he wondered whether some puzzles required more than individual skill to solve, whether some kinds of restoration required not solitary expertise, but collaborative effort. The thought was new to him, foreign to his established patterns of living and thinking, yet it persisted as he climbed to his loft, as he settled beneath quilts his grandmother had made decades before his birth, as he listened to the mountain wind and wondered what other changes tomorrow might bring to his carefully ordered life. 3 days after the McReynolds fire, Marcus found himself doing something he hadn't done in 15 years, knocking on a neighbor's door with the intention of offering help. The Kowalski sawmill operation sat in a natural clearing about 4 miles down from his ridge, accessible by a dirt road that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen groves. Anna Kowalski answered his knock, her weathered face showing surprise at finding the reclusive mountain man on her doorstep. In her early 40s, with calloused hands and sawdust perpetually dusting her work clothes, she had run the small mill operation with her late husband Peter until his heart attack 2 years prior. Since then, she had managed alone, cutting lumber for local construction projects and maintaining the equipment that kept her small business viable. "Marcus Thorne," she said, recognition dawning in her expression. "Haven't seen you down this way in quite some time. Is everything all right?" He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that he had no script for this kind of interaction. Heard about Tom and Janet McReynolds. Their place burned 3 days ago. Anna's expression grew serious. "Complete loss, from what I understand. Terrible. They're good people." "They are," Marcus agreed, then found himself struggling for words. "I was thinking, wondering if maybe there's something we could do. As neighbors, I mean." The admission felt foreign on his tongue. For 15 years, his problems had been his own to solve, his needs his own to meet. The concept of collective action, of neighbors organizing to help neighbors, challenged the fundamental assumptions he had built his adult life around. Anna studied his face for a moment, perhaps recognizing the significance of his presence here. "Come in," she said finally. "Let's talk about what that might look like." Her kitchen was warm and practical, dominated by a wood-burning stove that heated the entire house, and a large table scarred by years of use. Coffee percolated on the stovetop, filling the room with a rich aroma that reminded Marcus of his own morning routines. But unlike his solitary breakfast preparations, this space felt lived in, welcoming in ways his cabin had never aspired to be. "You know," Anna said, pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs, "I've been thinking the same thing. Tom helped me repair the mill's main belt drive last spring when I couldn't manage it alone. Never asked for anything in return, just showed up when I needed help." Marcus nodded, remembering similar small kindnesses he had received over the years. Tom's assistance with the snowdrift, Janet's occasional notes left in his mailbox when she made trips to town, asking if he needed supplies. Acts so minor he had barely registered them at the time, yet they had contributed to his ability to maintain his chosen isolation. "What did you have in mind?" Anna asked, settling across from him at the table. "I don't know exactly," Marcus admitted. "Maybe we could talk to the other neighbors, see if anyone has ideas about how to help." The suggestion surprised him even as he voiced it. The Marcus Thorne of a week ago would never have contemplated organizing community action. But the image of Tom and Janet standing in their driveway, watching their life disappear in smoke, had altered something fundamental in his perspective. Anna leaned back in her chair, considering. Bill Morrison might have thoughts about temporary housing. He's got that old ranger station on his property. Hasn't used it in years, but it's still structurally sound. The Hendersons have construction experience, built their own place from the ground up. She paused, studying Marcus with new interest. You realize what you're suggesting here? Getting involved, coordinating with people, taking responsibility for outcomes you can't completely control. Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. Marcus had structured his entire adult life around avoiding exactly these complications. Yet something about the current situation felt different, urgent, in ways that transcended his usual preference for non-involvement. Maybe it's time, he said quietly. Anna smiled, the first genuine warmth he had seen from her in their brief previous encounters. Peter always said you were a good man, hiding behind a wall of shyness. Maybe he was right. The comment stung slightly, though Marcus recognized its truth. His isolation hadn't been born from misanthropy, but from a deep uncertainty about his ability to navigate the complexities of human relationships. His father's death had come at a crucial time in his social development, forcing him into premature independence and self-reliance that had gradually hardened into habitual solitude. I'll talk to Bill Morrison today, Anna continued. You could approach the Hendersons. They respect you, even if you haven't spent much time getting to know them. Maria Henderson mentioned once that she admired your workshop setup, though it showed real craftsmanship. This was news to Marcus. He had encountered Maria Henderson perhaps a dozen times in 15 years, brief exchanges at the Millerville Post, office or hardware store. The idea that she had formed positive opinions about his work based on such minimal contact suggested a level of community awareness he had never suspected. What about the others? Marcus asked. There must be more families in the area. Anna nodded thoughtfully. Carl and Susan Wright run that organic farm up past Henderson's place. Keep to themselves mostly, but they've got resources, greenhouses, storage buildings, probably surplus produce they could share. And there's old Jake Martinez, who lives in that converted school bus near the creek. Doesn't look like much, but he's handy with electrical work. Used to be a contractor before he retired up here. The revelation that these mountains contained a network of capable, potentially helpful people challenged Marcus's long-held assumption that isolation was necessary for peace and independence. Perhaps the two concepts weren't mutually exclusive. Perhaps it was possible to maintain privacy and autonomy while still participating in a broader community of mutual support. Over the next several hours, Marcus found himself embarking on a series of conversations unlike any he had initiated in his adult life. Each neighbor he approached responded with immediate concern for the McReynolds and willingness to help in whatever way possible. Bill Morrison, the retired forest ranger, greeted him at the converted fire lookout that served as his home. At 67, Bill moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades assessing dangerous situations in wilderness settings. His property included the abandoned ranger station Anna had mentioned, a solid log structure that had housed seasonal fire crews in decades past. Been thinking about Tom and Janet myself, Bill said, after Marcus explained his purpose. Terrible thing, losing everything like that. The house I can understand, but all their personal belongings, photographs, mementos, that's the real tragedy. He gestured toward the old ranger station, visible through the trees about 100 yards from his main residence. The building's weatherproof, has basic plumbing and electrical, needs some work to be comfortable for winter living, but it's structurally sound. They're welcome to use it as long as necessary. The offer was generous beyond Marcus's expectations. Bill was essentially providing rent-free housing to neighbors he knew only casually, accepting responsibility for maintenance and utilities without expectation of compensation. "That's incredibly kind of you," Marcus said, genuinely moved by the gesture. Bill shrugged. "We look after each other up here. Has to be that way when you're 40 minutes from the nearest help." The comment echoed Tom's observation about good people within shouting distance, reinforcing Marcus's growing understanding that mountain living created its own forms of social obligation and mutual dependence. The Henderson place occupied a high meadow that caught afternoon sunlight and offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Marcus found Maria and Robert Henderson working in their large vegetable garden, harvesting late-season root crops before the first hard frost. Both in their early 50s, they had moved to the mountains after Robert's retirement from military service and built their homestead with methodical attention to sustainability and self-sufficiency. When Marcus explained the situation and his emerging plan to organize neighborhood assistance, Maria straightened from her work among the turnip rows, her expression immediately serious. "We heard about the fire," she said. "Been meaning to drive over and see if there was anything we could do to help." "That's exactly what I'm hoping to coordinate," Marcus replied. "Bill Morrison has offered temporary housing, but they'll need more than shelter." Robert, a compact man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, nodded thoughtfully. "House construction's the obvious need. The question is whether they want to rebuild on the same site or relocate somewhere safer." The practical consideration hadn't occurred to Marcus, but it made sense. If the McReynolds chimney fire had been caused by structural problems or poor maintenance, rebuilding in the same location might simply recreate the same risks. "Regardless," Maria said, brushing soil from her hands, "they'll need immediate supplies, clothing, toiletries, basic household items. We've got extra bedding, some furniture in storage, and this garden produces way more than 2 people can eat." She gestured at the impressive expanse of cultivated ground around them. Potatoes, carrots, onions, winter squash. Enough to keep them fed through spring if they're willing to eat seasonally. The conversation revealed another dimension of mountain living Marcus had never fully appreciated. These neighbors weren't just offering charity to disaster victims. They were extending the kind of practical support that made subsistence living possible in remote locations. Food sharing, resource pooling, and skill exchange formed an informal economy that operated parallel to the cash-based transactions of the outside world. By late afternoon, Marcus had visited 6 neighboring properties and received commitments of support that amazed him with their scope and generosity. The Wrights offered vegetables, eggs, and temporary workspace in one of their greenhouses. Jake Martinez volunteered electrical and plumbing expertise, along with a collection of construction tools accumulated over decades of contracting work. Most surprisingly, each neighbor he approached expressed enthusiasm for the coordinated effort itself. Rather than seeing it as an imposition or obligation, they seemed to welcome the opportunity to work together on a meaningful project. "Should have done something like this years ago," Carl Wright had commented while showing Marcus through his greenhouse operation. "We've all been living like hermits, but there's no reason we can't help each other out when times get tough." As evening approached and Marcus drove back toward his own ridge, he found his perspective on the surrounding landscape fundamentally altered. What had seemed like empty wilderness dotted with occasional isolated homesteads now revealed itself as a community of capable, interconnected people who shared resources, skills, and mutual concern for each other's welfare. The transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because it suggested possibilities for human connection. he had never imagined, terrifying because it challenged the assumptions about independence and self-reliance that had governed his choices for 15 years. His cabin, when he reached it, felt different again, smaller somehow and more fragile. The workshop with its precision tools and carefully organized timepieces remained exactly as he had left it. But the solitary satisfaction he usually drew from this orderly environment was tempered by awareness of the larger world beyond his walls. That evening, as he worked on a particularly challenging repair, a ship's chronometer from the 1890s that required complete movement reconstruction, Marcus found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the conversations of the day. Each neighbor had revealed aspects of mountain life he had never suspected, resources and capabilities that existed within shouting distance of his own property. Anna Kowalski's sawmill could provide lumber for construction projects. Bill Morrison's ranger experience included knowledge of building codes and safety regulations. The Hendersons' military background had given them logistics expertise and leadership skills. Jake Martinez possessed the technical knowledge to handle electrical and plumbing systems. Together, these neighbors represented a comprehensive set of capabilities that could tackle projects far beyond what any individual could accomplish alone. The McReynolds house fire had become the catalyst for Marcus to discover something he had never known existed: a community of competent, generous people who had been waiting years for someone to take the first step toward active cooperation. As he carefully adjusted the chronometer's delicate balance wheel, Marcus realized that his journey toward community involvement had already passed a point of no return. Tomorrow, he would need to contact Tom and Janet McReynolds, explain what their neighbors were prepared to offer, and begin the complex process of coordinating multiple people toward a common goal. The prospect filled him with anxiety about his ability to manage social dynamics he had spent 15 years avoiding. But it also stirred something he hadn't felt since his father's death: the possibility that his skills and resources might contribute to something larger and more meaningful than his own carefully maintained isolation. The chronometer ticked steadily on his workbench, its newly restored mechanism keeping perfect time. But unlike the solitary satisfaction he usually drew from such achievements, tonight Marcus found himself imagining the instrument's original purpose: guiding ships across vast oceans, enabling navigation and safe passage for crews who depended on its accuracy for their survival. Perhaps, he thought as he prepared for bed, there were different kinds of precision required in life. The mechanical precision he had mastered in his workshop was one kind, but the human precision needed to coordinate community action, to balance individual needs with collective goals, to navigate the complicated dynamics of mutual dependence. That was a skill set he had yet to develop. Tomorrow would begin his education in this new and unfamiliar territory. The phone call to Tom and Janet McReynolds was perhaps the most difficult conversation Marcus had ever initiated. Standing in his kitchen at dawn, coffee growing cold beside him, he stared at the number Anna Kowalski had provided, Janet's sister's landline in Denver. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed, not from cold, but from the unfamiliar weight of responsibility he was about to assume. Hello? A woman's voice, but not Janet's, younger, with urban inflections that marked her as city-born. This is Marcus Thorne, from up near Copper Ridge. I'm looking for Janet McReynolds. A pause. Oh, you're the neighbor. Janet mentioned you came by after the fire. Hold on, I'll get her. Marcus waited, listening to muffled conversation in the background. Denver sounded different through the phone: car horns, distant sirens, the general hum of urban life that felt alien after 15 years of mountain silence. Marcus, Janet's voice came through clearly, tired but alert. Is everything all right? I wanted to talk to you about options, Marcus began, then stopped, realizing he had no practiced way to explain what he was proposing. Your neighbors up here have been discussing ways we might be able to help. Another pause, longer this time. "That's very kind, Marcus, but I'm not sure what anyone can do at this point. The insurance adjuster won't even visit the site until next week, and preliminary estimates suggest we might recover 60% of replacement costs. On a teacher's pension, that doesn't go far toward rebuilding." The discouragement in her voice was palpable, but Marcus pressed on. What if rebuilding didn't require as much cash outlay? What if neighbors could provide labor, materials, and expertise? "I don't understand." Marcus took a breath, committing himself to words that would fundamentally alter his relationship with these people. "Bill Morrison has offered temporary housing. The old ranger station on his property. Anna Kowalski can provide lumber at cost. The Hendersons have construction experience. Jake Martinez handles electrical and plumbing work. The Wrights have building materials stored from their own construction projects." Silence stretched across the connection. When Janet finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality, hope mixed with disbelief. "Are you saying our neighbors want to rebuild our house?" "I'm saying we want to explore what's possible," Marcus replied carefully. "No commitments until you've had time to consider options and we've assessed the full scope of what would be involved." "Tom!" Janet called out, her voice distant as she addressed someone in the room with her. "Pick up the extension. You need to hear this." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Tom and Janet peppered Marcus with questions about logistics, timelines, costs, and the specific commitments various neighbors were prepared to make. Marcus found himself taking notes, promising to investigate details he had never considered, agreeing to coordinate meetings and site visits he had no experience organizing. By the time the call ended, Marcus had committed himself and his newfound community to an undertaking that would require months of coordinated effort, thousands of dollars in materials, and levels of cooperation none of them had ever attempted. "We'll drive up this weekend," Tom had concluded. "If what you're describing is even half possible, Janet and I want to be part of making it happen." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his kitchen, staring at 3 pages of handwritten notes and wondering what he had gotten himself into. The lists of required materials, estimated costs, and construction phases looked overwhelming on paper. But more daunting than the practical challenges was the human coordination aspect. Managing personalities, schedules, disagreements, and the inevitable complications that arose when multiple people worked towards shared goals. His first test came that afternoon when he convened an impromptu meeting at Anna Kowalski's kitchen table. The space that had seemed comfortably sized for 2 people felt cramped, with 6 neighbors crowded around it, each bringing their own perspectives, assumptions, and concerns to the discussion. Bill Morrison arrived first, carrying a folder of documents that included building permits, county regulations, and zoning requirements. "Checked with the county office this morning," he announced without preamble. "Rebuilding on the McReynolds site requires permits, inspections, and compliance. With current building codes, the previous structure was grandfathered under old standards." The information was important, but immediately complicated Marcus's vision of neighbors simply organizing to help neighbors. Government involvement meant paperwork, fees, official timelines, and bureaucratic oversight that could delay or derail the entire project. Maria Henderson arrived next, having driven down from her mountain meadow with a truck bed full of construction tools. "I brought measuring equipment," she explained. "If we're serious about this, we need accurate site surveys, foundation assessments, and utility connections." Her military precision was admirable, but added another layer of complexity to what Marcus had initially envisioned as a straightforward community effort. Each practical consideration revealed additional requirements, costs, and potential obstacles. Jake Martinez appeared 10 minutes later, his converted school bus parked in Anna's driveway like some artifact from a different era of American mobility. At 73, he moved carefully but with the purposeful economy of someone who had spent decades solving construction problems. His weathered hands bore the scars of a lifetime working with tools and machinery. Electrical service to the McReynolds place was damaged in the fire, he reported without greeting. Saw it yesterday when I drove by to assess the site. Main panels destroyed, service drop needs replacement, and we'll have to bring everything up to current code standards. More complications, more costs, more requirements for official inspections and permits. Marcus began to wonder whether his ambitious vision of community cooperation was naive, whether the regulatory and financial realities of construction would overwhelm their good intentions. Carl and Susan Wright arrived together, their hybrid sedan somehow managing the rough dirt road, despite its obviously urban design. Both in their late 40s, they had embraced mountain living with enthusiastic commitment to sustainability and environmental responsibility. Their organic farming operation reflected this philosophy, but Marcus wondered how their idealistic approach would mesh with the practical demands of construction work. We've been researching sustainable building methods, Susan announced, producing a laptop computer and several thick books about green construction techniques. If we're going to rebuild, shouldn't we incorporate solar heating, grey water systems, and natural building materials? The suggestion had merit, but it represented yet another complication in an already complex project. Each neighbor brought expertise and resources to the effort, but also brought their own priorities and preferences that would need to be balanced against practical constraints, and the McReynolds' actual needs and preferences. Anna Kowalski, as host of the meeting, attempted to bring focus to the increasingly scattered discussion. Maybe we should start with the basics, she suggested. What exactly are Tom and Janet hoping to rebuild? Same house in the same location or something different? The question exposed a fundamental assumption Marcus had made without confirming. In his phone conversation with the McReynolds, he had focused on the possibility of community assistance without clarifying what kind of assistance they actually wanted. Did they envision rebuilding their original home, or would they prefer something smaller, larger, more modern, more traditional? They'll be here this weekend, Marcus said. We can address those questions directly with them. Robert Henderson, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. His military background had taught him to assess resources and limitations before committing to operations. Before we make promises about what we can accomplish, we should honestly evaluate what we're equipped to handle. He pulled a notepad from his jacket pocket and began listing concerns. Foundation work requires heavy equipment we don't own. Electrical and plumbing must be done by licensed professionals to pass inspection. Roofing at that elevation demands experience with mountain weather conditions. We're talking about a 6-month project minimum, requiring coordination of multiple work phases. The systematic analysis was sobering. Robert's points highlighted the difference between wanting to help neighbors and possessing the actual capabilities. To complete a major construction project, Jake Martinez nodded agreement. I can handle the electrical work, still maintain my contractor's license, but Jake's right about the other trades. Plumbing's gotten complicated since I retired. Lots of new code requirements. Foundation work's beyond what we can do with hand tools. The meeting continued for another hour, with each neighbor contributing their assessment of what was and wasn't feasible within the scope of community volunteer effort. Gradually, a more realistic picture emerged of what they could reasonably accomplish. Anna S. Sawmill could provide dimensional lumber at wholesale cost, a significant savings over retail prices. Bill Morrison's ranger station offered rent-free temporary housing, eliminating that expense. The Hendersons could manage general carpentry and site preparation. The Wrights could contribute labor and some specialized materials. Jake Martinez, could handle electrical installation once permits were obtained. But major elements of the project, foundation work, plumbing installation, roofing, would require hiring professionals, obtaining permits, and coordinating with county inspectors. The community effort could reduce costs and provide essential labor, but it couldn't eliminate the fundamental complexities of construction work. "So what are we actually offering?" Marcus asked as the meeting wound down. Bill Morrison answered, thoughtfully, "We're offering to make rebuilding possible when it might otherwise be financially impossible. Not to do everything ourselves, but to contribute enough resources and labor that the McReynolds can afford to hire professionals for the work we can't handle." The distinction was important, and it represented a more mature understanding of community cooperation than Marcus's initial vision. They weren't proposing to replace professional construction services, but to supplement them in ways that made the overall project feasible. After the neighbors departed, Marcus remained in Anna's kitchen, helping clean coffee cups and reviewing the notes from the meeting. The discussion had been both encouraging and humbling. Encouraging because it demonstrated genuine commitment from multiple neighbors. Humbling because it revealed the complexity of translating good intentions into practical action. "Second thoughts?" Anna asked, noting his thoughtful silence. "Realistic thoughts," Marcus replied. "This is going to be harder than I initially imagined." Anna nodded. "Most worthwhile things are. The question is whether it's still worth doing when it's harder than you expected." The observation crystallized Marcus's internal struggle. His 15 years of mountain solitude had been built on avoiding exactly these kinds of complications. Projects that required coordinating multiple people, managing conflicting priorities, accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond his direct control. Yet something about the current situation felt different, urgent in ways that transcended his usual preference for non-involvement. Perhaps it was the image of Tom and Janet standing in their driveway, watching their life disappear in smoke. Perhaps it was the discovery that his chosen isolation existed within a network of capable, generous neighbors. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that some challenges were too large for individual solutions. That evening, Marcus worked in his shop on a particularly intricate pocket watch repair, a railroad timepiece whose previous owner had attempted amateur maintenance, with disastrous results. The movement was a tangle of broken springs, misaligned gears, and components forced into positions they were never designed to occupy. Restoring the watch would require completely disassembling the movement, cataloging each component, replacing damaged parts, and reassembling everything according to the original manufacturer's specifications. It was painstaking work that demanded absolute precision and systematic attention to detail. As he worked, Marcus found himself drawing parallels between watch repair and community organization. Both required understanding how individual components functioned within larger systems. Both demanded patience, precision, and the ability to coordinate multiple elements toward a unified purpose. But there were crucial differences. Mechanical systems operated according to physical laws that remained constant and predictable. Human systems operated according to social and emotional dynamics that shifted unpredictably and resisted systematic control. A watch spring either had proper tension or it didn't. A gear either meshed correctly with its neighbors or it didn't. There were objective standards for mechanical function that could be measured and verified. Community cooperation, by contrast, involved navigating personalities, managing expectations, balancing individual needs against collective goals, and accepting that success might be measured not by perfect execution, but by satisfactory compromise among competing interests. The pocket watch on his workbench could be restored to factory specifications, its timekeeping accuracy measurable to within seconds per day. The community project to rebuild the McReynolds house would be successful if it provided them with adequate shelter, even if the final result differed from anyone's initial vision. As midnight approached, Marcus carefully set aside his tools and covered the partially disassembled watch movement with a clean cloth. Tomorrow would bring Tom and Janet McReynolds back to the mountains, and the first real test of whether good intentions could be transformed into effective action. The phone rang just as he was preparing for bed. Janet's voice came through clearly, though she was calling from Denver. "Marcus, I wanted to call before we drive up tomorrow. Tom and I have been talking, and we want you to know how much we appreciate what you're organizing. But we also want to be realistic about what we can accept from neighbors." Marcus settled into a kitchen chair, recognizing that this conversation might be as important as the meeting with neighbors had been. "We don't want charity," Janet continued. "We want to contribute fairly to our own rebuilding, whether through labor, materials, or cash payments for professional services. This needs to be a partnership, not a rescue." The distinction was important, and it revealed the McReynolds' understanding of community dynamics that Marcus was still learning to navigate. Accepting help gracefully was as much a skill as offering help effectively, and both required maintaining dignity and reciprocity within relationships of mutual dependence. "That makes sense," Marcus replied. "We're not trying to solve your problems. For you, we're trying to make solving them possible." "Exactly, and Marcus," Janet's voice carried warmth that had been absent during their previous conversations. "Thank you for taking the first step. Tom and I have lived in these mountains for 12 years, but we never really understood what community could mean until now." After ending the call, Marcus climbed to his loft with a sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Tomorrow would begin the practical phase of the most ambitious undertaking of his adult life. Success would require skills he had never developed, patience he had never tested, and faith in human cooperation he had spent 15 years avoiding. But as he settled beneath his grandmother's quilts, listening to the familiar night sounds of wind through pine boughs and the distant creek running over stones, Marcus realized that his journey toward community involvement had already transformed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The solitary satisfaction he had drawn from precision work in his shop remained important to him, but it no longer felt sufficient. There were other kinds of satisfaction available, the satisfaction that came from coordinating individual efforts toward shared goals, from contributing to something larger than personal achievement, from discovering that isolation and community weren't necessarily opposing choices. Tomorrow would test whether these new insights could survive contact with the practical complexities of construction work, permit applications, personality conflicts, and the 100 unexpected challenges that would arise when theory met reality. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Marcus Thorne fell asleep, looking forward to working with other people, rather than retreating from them. The weekend visit from Tom and Janet McReynolds began with optimism and ended with Marcus questioning everything he thought he understood about community cooperation. What started as a hopeful site assessment quickly devolved into a series of revelations that threatened to destroy the entire rebuilding project before it could properly begin. Tom and Janet arrived Saturday morning in a borrowed pickup truck, their faces showing the strain of a week spent navigating insurance paperwork and temporary living arrangements in Denver. They had driven through the night, eager to see their property and assess the possibilities Marcus had described. But as they stood once again in their driveway, surveying the blackened foundations and scattered debris, the magnitude of starting over seemed to settle on them with renewed weight. "It looks worse than I remembered," Janet said quietly, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent days trying to maintain hope against mounting obstacles. Marcus had arrived early with Anna Kowalski, both carrying measuring equipment and notebooks to document the site conditions systematically. The other neighbors would join them throughout the day, each contributing their expertise to a comprehensive assessment of what rebuilding would actually require. The first shock came when Bill Morrison arrived with the county building inspector, a thin man named David Chen, who approached the site with the methodical skepticism of someone who had seen too many ambitious construction projects founder on regulatory realities. The original structure was built in 1998, Chen said, consulting a thick folder of documents. Predates several significant code changes, particularly regarding foundation depth, seismic bracing, and energy efficiency standards. He walked the perimeter of the destroyed house, making notes on a digital tablet and occasionally kneeling to examine foundation remnants more closely. Current codes require foundations extending below the frost line, 4 feet minimum at this elevation. The original foundation appears to be 18 inches, maybe 2 feet in places. The technical language translated to a simple reality. Rebuilding on the existing foundation would violate current codes, but meeting current codes would require excavating and pouring an entirely new foundation at substantially higher cost. "What's the financial difference?" Tom asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer would be unwelcome. Chen consulted his tablet. "Rough estimate, foundation work alone could run $15,000 to $20,000. That's before framing, electrical, plumbing, or any finish work." The number landed like a physical blow. Marcus watched Tom and Janet exchange glances that communicated volumes about their financial limitations and the growing gap between their insurance settlement and actual rebuilding costs. "There might be alternatives," Chen continued, his tone suggesting professional obligation rather than optimism. "Manufactured housing doesn't require the same foundation standards, or you could consider a smaller structure that minimizes square footage and associated costs." The suggestions were practical, but represented fundamental compromises to Tom and Janet's vision of rebuilding their life in the mountains. Marcus found himself wondering whether his ambitious community effort had raised false hopes that would ultimately prove more cruel than helpful. The second shock came when Jake Martinez arrived with his own assessment of the electrical and plumbing requirements. At 73, Jake had maintained his contractor's licenses through continuing education requirements, but his inspection of the site revealed complications beyond what anyone had anticipated. Fire damaged the main electrical service and destroyed the well pump house, he reported, his weathered face grave. "Utility companies will require complete service upgrades to current standards. 200-amp panel, GFCI protection throughout, arc fault breakers for bedroom circuits." He gestured toward a blackened concrete pad about 50 yards from the house site. "Well, it's still good, but the pump and pressure tank were destroyed. The septic system might have been compromised by emergency vehicles driving over the drain." Field. Each technical detail added thousands of dollars to the project cost. Marcus realized that his initial vision of neighbors contributing labor and materials had been naive about the specialized, expensive infrastructure that modern mountain living required. The third and most devastating shock came when Maria Henderson arrived with her husband Robert and a civil engineer she had contacted during the week. The engineer, Patricia Valdez, specialized in mountain construction and had agreed to assess the site as a favor to the Hendersons. "I'm concerned about this location for rebuilding," Valdez announced after completing her survey of the property. "Fire started from a chimney problem, but the underlying issue is wind patterns and updrafts in this particular valley." She produced a topographical map and pointed to the McReynolds property's position relative to surrounding ridges and draws. "This site sits in a natural wind funnel that creates extremely strong updrafts during certain weather conditions. Any wood-burning heat source is going to face unusual stress and safety challenges." The revelation suggested that rebuilding in the same location might simply recreate the conditions that had caused the original fire. Tom and Janet had lost their home, not due to poor maintenance or bad luck, but because of fundamental geographic factors that would continue to pose risks regardless of construction quality. "Are you saying we can't rebuild here?" Tom asked, his voice tight with the strain of absorbing one setback after another. "I'm saying rebuilding here safely would require extensive engineering modifications that could double or triple construction costs," Valdez replied. "Fire-resistant materials, specialized chimney design, possibly alternative heating systems that don't involve combustion." The cascading complications had transformed Marcus's hopeful community project into a series of technical and financial obstacles that seemed to grow larger with each expert assessment. By midday, the group of neighbors and professionals standing in the McReynolds driveway had the subdued atmosphere of mourners at a funeral. "Maybe we should take a break," Anna Kowalski suggested, recognizing the emotional toll the morning's revelations were taking on everyone, particularly Tom and Janet Dott, but the afternoon brought even more discouraging developments. Carl and Susan Wright arrived with research they had conducted about sustainable building methods, only to learn that many environmentally friendly construction techniques were prohibited by county codes or incompatible with the site's challenging conditions. "We found some promising options for natural building materials," Susan said, producing a folder of information about straw bale construction and rammed earth techniques. "But the building inspector says none of these methods meet current codes for residential construction in high wind zones." The regulatory framework that governed construction in the mountains had been designed to ensure safety and durability, but it also eliminated many cost-saving alternatives that might have made rebuilding feasible on a teacher's pension. Marcus found himself caught between his neighbor's genuine desire to help and the harsh mathematical realities of construction costs, building codes, and the McReynolds' limited financial resources. Every solution generated new problems. Every cost-saving measure was blocked by regulatory requirements or site conditions. The breaking point came when Tom pulled Marcus aside late in the afternoon, his frustration and discouragement finally overwhelming his natural courtesy. "Marcus, I appreciate everything you and the neighbors have tried to do," Tom said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "But I think we need to face facts. Rebuilding here isn't financially possible, even with all the help you've organized." The admission felt like personal failure to Marcus. He had initiated this community effort with confidence that neighbors working together could solve problems that individuals couldn't handle alone. Instead, he had created a situation where Tom and Janet's limitations were exposed publicly, where their private financial struggles became community knowledge, where hope had been raised only to be systematically demolished by technical realities. "Maybe there are other options we haven't considered," Marcus said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Tom shook his head. "Insurance settlement might cover 60% of replacement cost for a standard house. What we're looking at here would cost twice what insurance covers, assuming we can even get permits for rebuilding in this location." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, a man in an expensive SUV who introduced himself as Craig Hoffman from Mountain Vista Development Corporation. In his 40s, wearing clothing that suggested urban origins and suburban preferences, Hoffman had the polished manner of someone accustomed to turning other people's problems into his own opportunities. "Heard about the fire," Hoffman said, approaching Tom and Janet with practiced sympathy. "Terrible tragedy. I wanted to express my condolences and possibly discuss some options that might interest you." His presence felt intrusive, a commercial interruption to what had been a day of personal and community struggle. But Tom and Janet, exhausted by the day's series of setbacks, were willing to listen to anyone who might offer practical solutions. "My company specializes in mountain property development," Hoffman explained. "We purchase lots from owners who face rebuilding challenges, handle all the permit and construction issues ourselves, then develop vacation rental properties or second homes for urban buyers." He gestured at the surrounding mountain landscape as if it were raw material for profitable transformation. "This location has tremendous potential for high-end development, spectacular views, access to recreational opportunities close enough to Denver for weekend retreats." The offer was straightforward. Mountain Vista would purchase the McReynolds property at fair market value, eliminating their need to navigate construction complexities or absorb rebuilding costs. Tom and Janet could use the proceeds to purchase different property, perhaps at lower elevation, where building codes were less restrictive and construction costs more manageable. "We'd need to have the lot surveyed and assessed," Hoffman continued, "but preliminary estimates suggest we could offer substantially more than insurance settlement amounts. Enough for you folks to start fresh somewhere more suitable for retirement living." The proposal was seductive in its simplicity. All the technical problems, financial limitations, and regulatory complications that had dominated the day's discussions would become someone else's responsibility. Tom and Janet could walk away with cash in hand, free to begin again without the stress of coordinating construction projects or managing community expectations. Marcus watched the interaction with growing dismay. Hoffman's offer represented everything. Marcus had hoped to help Tom and Janet avoid displacement from the community they had called home for 12 years, transformation of their mountain neighborhood into commercial development, loss of the connections and relationships that defined their chosen way of life. But he also recognized that his community effort had failed to provide viable alternatives. Despite the genuine commitment of multiple neighbors, despite offers of labor and materials and expertise, the practical realities of mountain construction had overwhelmed their good intentions. "It's an interesting proposal," Tom said diplomatically. "Janet and I would need time to consider all our options." Hoffman nodded, understanding. "Of course, these are major decisions, but I'd encourage you not to wait too long. Mountain property values are strong right now, but that could change with economic conditions or regulatory modifications." After Hoffman departed, the group of neighbors stood in uncomfortable silence. The developer's visit had reframed their entire day's work, transforming their community rebuilding effort into an obstacle to what might be Tom and Janet's most practical solution. "I should go," Marcus said finally, unable to tolerate the weight of his apparent failure to coordinate. Effective help for neighbors who had trusted his initiative. But as he walked toward his truck, Janet called after him, "Marcus, wait!" She approached him with an expression he couldn't interpret. Not anger, but something more complex that combined gratitude with disappointment and perhaps understanding of his own distress. "This isn't your fault," she said quietly. "What you organized today, getting all these neighbors together, learning what's actually involved in rebuilding, that needed to happen regardless of the outcome." Her kindness made his sense of failure more acute rather than less. He had promised solutions and delivered only a clearer understanding of problems. "I thought community cooperation could solve problems that individuals couldn't handle alone," Marcus said. "But maybe some problems are just too big for neighbors to solve." Janet studied his face for a moment. "Or maybe community cooperation means something different than we initially thought. Maybe it's not about solving each other's problems, but about facing them together, so no one has to carry the whole weight alone." The insight was profound, but Marcus was too discouraged to fully absorb its implications. As he drove back to his cabin through the gathering mountain dusk, he found himself questioning not just the rebuilding project, but his entire journey toward community involvement. Had his 15 years of isolation been a more honest recognition of human limitations than this recent experiment in collective action? Were the complications and disappointments of the day simply the price of engaging with other people's problems? Proof that his chosen solitude protected him from failures and frustrations that were inherent in community relationships. His cabin, when he reached it, felt both familiar and foreign. The workshop with its precision tools and orderly timepieces remained exactly as he had left it, but the satisfaction he usually drew from this controlled environment was complicated by awareness of the larger world beyond his walls, a world where good intentions collided with regulatory requirements, where community spirit encountered financial limitations, where helping neighbors proved more complex than repairing mechanical devices. That evening, as he worked on the railroad watch that still awaited completion, Marcus found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Craig Hoffman's visit. The developer's polished proposal had highlighted the gap between what Marcus's community effort could offer and what Tom and Janet actually needed. Perhaps the most honest outcome would be for the McReynolds to accept Hoffman's buyout offer, use the proceeds to purchase property somewhere more suitable for rebuilding, and begin again in a location where community cooperation might actually be sufficient to address their needs. But the thought of his mountain neighborhood transformed into vacation rental properties for urban visitors filled Marcus with a sense of loss he couldn't fully articulate. The network of relationships he had only recently discovered would be broken. The community he had just begun to understand would be diminished by the conversion of neighbors' homes into commercial properties. As midnight approached and fatigue finally overcame his mental churning, Marcus realized that tomorrow would bring decisions that would define not just the McReynolds' future, but the character of his entire mountain community. The crisis that had begun with a house fire had evolved into something larger, a test of whether neighbors could actually help neighbors in meaningful ways, or whether the complexities of modern life inevitably required professional solutions that only commercial developers could afford to provide. The railroad watch ticked steadily on his workbench, its newly adjusted mechanism keeping perfect time. But unlike the mechanical precision he had mastered in his workshop, the human precision needed to coordinate effective community action remained beyond his capabilities, perhaps beyond anyone's capabilities when problems reached a certain scale of complexity. Marcus climbed to his loft that night with the heaviest heart he had experienced since his father's death 15 years earlier. Tomorrow would likely bring the end of his ambitious experiment in community cooperation, and a return to the isolation that had once seemed like wisdom, but now felt like defeat. Marcus spent Sunday morning in his workshop, attempting to lose himself in the familiar precision of timepiece repair, but concentration proved impossible. The railroad watch that had occupied his attention for weeks lay disassembled on his workbench, its components arranged in careful order, yet every time he reached for his tools, images from the previous day intruded, Tom and Janet's faces as each expert assessment revealed new obstacles. Craig Hoffman's polished certainty that commercial development offered the only practical solution, his own growing recognition that good intentions weren't sufficient to overcome structural realities. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his brooding. Through his workshop window, Marcus saw Anna Kowalski's pickup truck climbing the winding road to his cabin. She parked beside his own vehicle and stepped out, carrying what appeared to be a thermos of coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. "You might want company this morning," Anna said without preamble when Marcus opened his door. "Yesterday was rough on everyone, but it hit you particularly hard." Her directness was characteristic, but Marcus appreciated it more than polite circumlocutions would have been. "I feel like I raised false hopes," he admitted, leading her into his kitchen. "Got everyone's expectations up for something that was never really possible." Anna settled at his kitchen table and poured coffee from her thermos into 2 cups. Maybe. Or maybe we just learned something important about the difference between helping neighbors and solving their problems for them. The distinction echoed Janet's comment from the previous evening, but Marcus wasn't ready to accept that the day's failures might contain useful insights. Tom and Janet trusted me to coordinate something meaningful. Instead, I organized a public demonstration of why their situation is hopeless. Is it hopeless? Anna asked, opening her folder and spreading several documents across the table. That's actually what I came to discuss. Marcus recognized some of the papers, copies of building permits, county regulations, contractor estimates that had been generated during yesterday's assessments. But Anna had added new materials, printouts from internet searches, handwritten notes, what appeared to be correspondence with various organizations. Spent most of last night researching alternatives, Anna explained. Started with the assumption that rebuilding on the original site really is impractical, financially and technically. But that doesn't mean Tom and Janet have to choose between accepting Hoffman's buyout or abandoning mountain living entirely. She pointed to a topographical map that showed the broader area around the McReynolds property. There are other buildable lots within 5 miles of their original location, places where foundation requirements are less stringent, wind patterns less problematic, construction costs more manageable. Marcus studied the map, recognizing some of the locations Anna had marked. Most of that land isn't for sale, and what is available would still require significant cash outlays for purchase. Not necessarily, Anna replied, pulling out another document. This is a land-sharing agreement template I found. It's used in rural communities where neighbors pool resources to help families stay in the area when economic circumstances change. The concept was unfamiliar to Marcus, but as Anna explained the basic structure, he began to understand its potential relevance. Rather than purchasing land outright, families could enter into long-term lease arrangements with landowners, paying modest monthly fees instead of large lump sums for property acquisition. Bill Morrison has 40 acres, Anna continued, only uses about 5 for his own needs. The Hendersons have 60 acres with plenty of buildable sites. Even the Wrights have extra land that could accommodate another family without impacting their farming operation. The possibility hadn't occurred to Marcus during the previous day's discussions. Everyone had assumed that rebuilding meant rebuilding in the same location, that helping the McReynolds meant enabling them to restore exactly what they had lost. But Anna's research suggested alternative definitions of success. You're talking about the McReynolds becoming tenants on someone else's property, Marcus said, trying to understand the implications. Would that provide the security and independence they're looking for? Anna nodded. Done right, it could provide more security than rebuilding on their original site. Land sharing agreements can include options to purchase, equity building arrangements, even inheritance provisions for long-term tenants. She pulled out more documents, examples of successful land sharing arrangements from other rural communities, legal templates for structuring such agreements, resources for families transitioning from ownership to alternative forms of land tenure. The key advantage, Anna explained, is that it eliminates the largest single cost of rebuilding, land acquisition. Also eliminates some of the regulatory complications, since building on established residential property often involves simpler permitting processes. Marcus found himself intrigued, despite his lingering discouragement from the previous day. Anna's research represented a different approach to problem-solving, one that accepted certain constraints while seeking creative workarounds rather than direct confrontation with obstacles. Have you discussed this with any of the neighbors who might have suitable land? Marcus asked. That's why I'm here, Anna replied. This kind of arrangement requires community buy-in, particularly from whoever would be offering land for long-term lease. Thought we should approach them together as a coordinated effort. The suggestion represented a return to community organizing, but with a more realistic understanding of what such efforts could accomplish. Rather than attempting to overcome technical and financial obstacles through volunteer labor, Anna proposed working within existing constraints to create new possibilities. Before Marcus could respond, they heard another vehicle approaching. Through the window, they saw Bill Morrison's truck, followed closely by the Henderson sedan. Both vehicles parked near Anna's pickup, and their occupants emerged carrying coffee cups and notebooks that suggested this gathering had been coordinated in advance. "You organized a meeting without telling me," Marcus observed. Anna smiled. "Organized a conversation. Figured we all needed to process yesterday's events and consider what comes next." Bill Morrison entered the cabin first, his expression serious but not discouraged. "Been thinking all night about that developer's visit," he said without preamble. "Man had the right solution for the wrong problem." Maria and Robert Henderson followed, both carrying folders similar to Anna's. "We did some research too," Maria announced. "Focused on construction methods that might reduce costs without compromising safety or code compliance." The kitchen table quickly became crowded as 4 neighbors spread documents, maps, and notes across its surface. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of hosting a planning meeting in his own home. The solitary space he had protected for 15 years suddenly transformed into a center of community coordination. "Let's start with Bill's comment. About the developer," Anna suggested. "What did you mean about the right solution for the wrong problem?" Bill Morrison consulted his notes before answering. "Hoffman's correction that the McReynolds' original building site presents challenges that make rebuilding expensive and potentially unsafe. His solution, buying them out and developing vacation rentals, solves his problem of acquiring mountain property for commercial development." He gestured at Anna's topographical map. "But there are other solutions that solve Tom and Janet's actual problem. Finding a way to continue living in this mountain community without financial ruin." Robert Henderson nodded agreement. "The military taught me to distinguish between tactical problems and strategic problems. Yesterday we got bogged down in tactical details, foundation depths, electrical codes, permit requirements. Lost sight of the strategic objective." "Which is?" Marcus asked. "Keeping Tom and Janet as our neighbors," Maria answered. "Whether that happens on their original property or somewhere else in the area is less important than making sure they don't have to leave the community entirely." The reframing was profound. Marcus realized that his own thinking had been constrained by assumptions about what constituted success in helping neighbors. He had focused on enabling the McReynolds to rebuild their exact previous life, rather than helping them build a sustainable future life in the same general area. "Anna mentioned land-sharing arrangements," Marcus said. "How realistic are those for our situation?" Bill Morrison answered immediately. "Very realistic. I've got 35 acres that are just sitting unused. Good building sites, existing access roads, utilities already run partway across the property. For my own needs." He pointed to locations on the map where his property offered buildable sites. "Could lease a couple acres for house and garden, with option to purchase when and if their financial situation improves. Monthly lease payments would be modest, enough to cover property taxes and basic maintenance, not much more." The offer was generous beyond anything Marcus had expected. Bill was essentially proposing to become the McReynolds' landlord under terms that prioritized their housing security over his own financial return. "I could offer something similar," Maria Henderson added. "Our property has several sites that would work for a modest house, and being closer to our place would make resource sharing easier. Tools, equipment, seasonal labor for gardens and property maintenance." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with each neighbor contributing ideas that built on and refined the other's suggestions. Rather than focusing on obstacles and limitations, they explored possibilities and creative adaptations that could make mountain living feasible within the McReynolds' actual financial constraints. Robert Henderson had researched modular construction, methods that could reduce building costs by 30 to 40%. Anna had found information about owner-builder permits that would allow Tom and Janet to do much of the work themselves, with neighbors providing skilled assistance where needed. Maria had contacted a non-profit organization that provided construction loans at below-market interest rates for rural families. Bill had investigated utility connection costs for various sites on his property. The emerging picture was dramatically different from the previous day's grim assessments. Instead of a single overwhelming challenge, they now saw multiple manageable tasks that could be addressed sequentially over several months or even years. "We're talking about a different kind of house than what burned down," Anna summarized. "Smaller, simpler, built to different priorities, but potentially more sustainable financially and environmentally. And a different kind of community relationship," Bill added. "Less individual ownership, more shared resources and mutual support." Marcus found himself energized by the discussion in ways that surprised him. The previous day's failures had temporarily convinced him that community cooperation was naive idealism. But the neighbors' research and creative problem-solving suggested that cooperation simply required more realistic expectations and better understanding of available resources. "Should we contact Tom and Janet about these possibilities?" Marcus: "Yes, I already did," Anna replied. "Called them this morning before driving up here. They're interested enough to drive back up tomorrow for another conversation." The revelation that Anna had taken initiative to restart the process touched something deep in Marcus's understanding of how community action actually worked. He had assumed that his role as initial organizer made him responsible for all subsequent coordination. But effective cooperation apparently involved multiple people taking responsibility for different aspects of shared projects. "They asked specifically that you be involved in tomorrow's conversation," Anna continued. "Tom said your willingness to take the first step toward community help meant more to them than whether any particular solution worked out." The comment provided a different perspective on the previous day's apparent failures. Perhaps the value of Marcus's initiative lay not in its immediate practical results, but in its demonstration that neighbors were willing to organize on each other's behalf when circumstances required coordinated response. As the meeting wound down and neighbors prepared to return to their own properties, Marcus found himself reflecting on the transformation in his kitchen table. 2 hours earlier, it had been covered with documents cataloging obstacles and limitations. Now it held maps, construction plans, financial projections, and legal templates for arrangements that could enable the McReynolds to remain in the mountain community. The change represented more than different paperwork. It reflected a fundamental shift in approach, from attempting to overcome external constraints through force of will to working creatively within those constraints to achieve modified but still meaningful goals. "One more thing," Bill Morrison said, as the others prepared to leave. "We should probably discuss what happens if Tom and Janet decide to accept Hoffman's buyout offer instead of pursuing these alternatives." The question was important, and it forced the group to acknowledge that their neighbors' decisions ultimately belonged to their neighbors. Community support could provide options, but it couldn't eliminate individual choice and responsibility. "Then, we respect their decision and help them transition however we can," Anna replied. "Community cooperation doesn't mean forcing particular outcomes on people." After the neighbors departed, Marcus remained at his kitchen table, reviewing the documents and notes they had left behind. The railroad watch still awaited completion in his workshop, its mechanical problems requiring the same precise attention they had demanded for weeks. But the human problems addressed in the morning's meeting seemed more complex and more interesting than any timepiece repair he had ever attempted. The neighbor's research had revealed possibilities for creative adaptation that purely individual efforts would never have discovered. A's afternoon shadows lengthened across his property. Marcus realized that his journey toward community involvement had entered a new phase. The previous day's crisis had tested his initial assumptions about what neighbors could accomplish together. This morning's meeting had refined those assumptions into more realistic but still ambitious goals. Tomorrow would bring another test. Whether Tom and Janet found the alternatives sufficiently appealing to commit to a future that would be different from their past, but still rooted in the mountain community they had called home for 12 years. The outcome remained uncertain. But for the first time since the McReynolds fire, Marcus felt that uncertainty represented potential rather than limitation. Community cooperation, properly understood, didn't eliminate life's complexities. It provided resources for navigating those complexities with support, creativity, and shared commitment to outcomes that served everyone's long-term interests. That evening, as he finally returned to work on the railroad watch, Marcus found his concentration improved and his satisfaction in precision work enhanced by awareness of the larger human context in which such individual efforts took place. The watch would keep perfect time once completed, but its accuracy would serve purposes defined by relationships and commitments that extended far beyond the mechanical precision of its internal components. Community and solitude, he was learning, weren't opposing choices, but complementary aspects of a life lived with attention to both individual excellence and collective well-being. Tomorrow would test whether that insight could translate into practical solutions for neighbors who trusted his coordination of their shared efforts. Monday morning brought Tom and Janet McReynolds back to the mountains, but this time they arrived, accompanied by Craig Hoffman and another man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as legal counsel for Mountain Vista Development Corporation. The presence of the developer and his attorney transformed what Marcus had anticipated as a hopeful discussion about community alternatives into something that felt more like a confrontation between competing visions of the McReynolds' future. Marcus met them at Anna Kowalski's sawmill, which had been chosen as a neutral location where multiple vehicles could park and documents could be spread on work tables. The other neighbors had arrived early, their research from the previous day organized into presentation folders that suddenly seemed amateurish compared to the leather portfolios carried by Hoffman's team. Before we discuss alternatives, Hoffman announced without preamble, I want to ensure everyone understands the timeline pressures involved in this situation. He gestured to his attorney, who produced a thick document and placed it on Anna's work table. Mountain Vista's offer to purchase the McReynolds property is valid for 72 hours from this moment. After that, we move to other acquisition targets and this opportunity disappears. The ultimatum was clearly designed to prevent extended deliberation about community alternatives. Marcus recognized the tactic as psychological pressure intended to force quick decisions that favored the developer's interests, but understanding the manipulation didn't eliminate its effectiveness. Tom and Janet exchanged glances that communicated their awareness of being caught between competing pressures. The community alternatives that Anna and others had researched over the weekend offered long-term sustainability, but required months of planning and construction. Hoffman's buyout offer provided immediate financial resolution, but meant leaving the mountain community permanently. We appreciate the community effort, Tom said carefully, but we also need to be realistic about our situation. We can't impose on Janet's sister in Denver indefinitely, and we can't afford to carry property ownership costs while exploring alternatives that might not work out. Janet nodded agreement. The neighbors have been incredibly generous with their research and offers of help. But generosity isn't the same as guaranteed solutions, and we can't ask people to commit resources to projects that might fail. Their caution was understandable, but it felt like rejection of everything the community had worked to develop. Marcus found himself struggling with the gap between good intentions and practical limitations, between what neighbors wanted to offer and what the McReynolds felt they could accept. "Let's look at specifics," Anna suggested, opening her folder of research and spreading documents across the table. "These aren't vague promises, but concrete alternatives with defined costs, timelines, and responsibilities." The presentation that followed was more comprehensive than Marcus had expected. Anna had coordinated with each neighbor to develop detailed proposals for land sharing arrangements, construction plans, financing options, and resource commitments. The information was professionally organized and thoroughly researched. Bill Morrison presented his land lease proposal first, using survey maps and construction estimates to demonstrate how a modest house could be built on his property within the McReynolds' budget constraints. The monthly lease payments would be significantly lower than typical rent, and the agreement would include options to purchase the land if their financial situation improved. Total construction costs for a 200-square-foot house using modular methods and owner-builder permits would run approximately $45,000, Bill explained. Insurance settlement covers most of that, and the non-profit loan program Anna researched can bridge any gap at below-market interest rates. Maria Henderson followed with information about construction logistics, volunteer labor coordination, and timeline estimates. The project would take approximately 6 months from permit approval to occupancy. We can provide skilled supervision and supplementary labor to keep costs manageable. The Wrights presented sustainable building options that would reduce long-term operating costs through solar heating, rainwater collection, and organic gardening integration. Jake Martinez had prepared detailed electrical and plumbing plans that met current codes, while minimizing installation complexity. The collective presentation revealed the extent of research and planning the neighbors had accomplished in just 2 days. Every aspect of construction, financing, and property arrangements had been considered and documented. The community alternative wasn't wishful thinking, but a comprehensive plan, with realistic budgets and timelines. Hoffman listened to the presentations with polite attention that barely concealed his impatience. When the neighbors finished, he responded with practiced dismissiveness. "These are admirable efforts," he said, "but they illustrate exactly why professional development companies exist. You're asking Tom and Janet to coordinate multiple contractors, navigate permit processes, manage construction timelines, and assume financial risks for an outcome that remains uncertain." He gestured at his own documents. "Mountain Vista eliminates all those complications. We handle permits, construction management, regulatory compliance, and financial guarantees. Tom and Janet receive cash payment and walk away from all responsibilities and risks." The contrast was stark. The community alternative required the McReynolds to become actively involved in complex construction coordination. Hoffman's offer eliminated their involvement entirely, but also eliminated their connection to the mountain community. "There's another consideration," Hoffman's attorney added, producing additional documents. "Property values in this area are likely to decline significantly over the next few years as climate change increases wildfire risks and insurance companies reduce coverage for mountain properties." The prediction was presented as factual analysis, but Marcus recognized it as speculative pressure designed to create urgency around the buyout offer. Whether property values would actually decline depended on numerous unpredictable factors, but the possibility was real enough to influence decision-making. "Our offer represents current market value," the attorney continued. Waiting to pursue alternatives could result in substantially lower recovery of the McReynolds property investment. Tom looked increasingly overwhelmed by the competing pressures and conflicting information. "I appreciate everything the neighbors have put together," he said slowly, "but Craig raises valid concerns about risk and complexity. We're not construction managers. We don't know how to coordinate projects like this." "You don't have to coordinate them alone," Marcus found himself saying, speaking up for the first time during the meeting. "That's what community cooperation means, sharing responsibilities so no individual has to carry them all." The words surprised him as he spoke them, but they felt true in ways that transcended his usual discomfort with assertive statements. His 15 years of isolation had taught him the value of individual self-reliance, but the past 2 weeks had revealed the limitations of purely individual solutions to complex problems. "Marcus is right," Anna added. "We're not asking you to manage construction alone. We're offering to manage it together, with each neighbor contributing expertise in areas where they're qualified and learning from others in areas where they're not." Robert Henderson nodded. "Military operations succeed through coordinated effort among people with complementary skills. This is the same principle applied to civilian construction." The discussion continued for another hour, with neighbors addressing specific concerns about risks, timelines, and responsibilities. Gradually, a picture emerged of how community cooperation could function in practice, not as charity imposed on recipients, but as mutual support among neighbors who recognized their interdependence. But Hoffman's ultimatum remained in effect, creating artificial urgency that favored quick decisions over thoughtful deliberation. Marcus realized that the developer's strategy was succeeding despite the quality of community alternatives. Fear of complexity and risk was an overwhelming rational assessment of available options. The turning point came when Janet asked a question that none of the presentations had directly addressed. "If we accept community help to rebuild, what happens to our relationships with all of you? Do we become permanent dependents on neighbors' generosity, or is there a way to contribute equally to community efforts?" The question revealed the core of her hesitation. Accepting help gracefully required maintaining dignity and reciprocity within relationships of mutual dependence. Janet was concerned about becoming a burden rather than an equal participant in community life. "You contribute the same way everyone else does," Bill Morrison answered. "Through skills, labor, resources, whatever you have to offer when neighbors need help with their own projects." He gestured around the sawmill where they were meeting. "Anna provides lumber when people need construction materials. I share my ranger experience when someone has questions about mountain living. The Hendersons contribute construction expertise. You and Tom have teaching backgrounds. That's expertise this community needs for education, organization, and problem solving." Maria Henderson added, "Community cooperation works when everyone contributes according to their abilities and receives according to their needs. Your needs are urgent right now because of the fire, but everyone has urgent needs sometimes." The explanation seemed to address Janet's concerns about dignity and reciprocity. Rather than accepting charity, she and Tom would be joining a network of mutual support where contributions and benefits balanced over time, rather than in each individual transaction. "There's something else to consider," Jake Martinez said quietly. At 73, his perspective carried weight that came from decades of mountain living. Hoffman's company will develop vacation rentals for urban visitors. That changes the character of this community permanently. He gestured toward the mountains visible through the sawmill's windows. "We chose this place because it offered something different from city living: space, quiet, neighbors who knew each other and looked out for each other. Commercial development replaces that with strangers who visit occasionally and contribute nothing to community life." The observation highlighted stakes that extended beyond the McReynolds' individual situation. Their decision would influence the future character of the entire mountain community. Accepting Hoffman's buyout would contribute to transformation of the area from a place where neighbors supported neighbors into a commercial destination for temporary visitors. Tom looked around the group of neighbors who had spent days researching alternatives and coordinating resources on his behalf. "You're all willing to commit this much time and effort to help people you barely know?" "We're willing to commit time and effort to preserve a community we value," Anna corrected. "You and Janet are part of that community. Losing you weakens all of us." The distinction was important. Community cooperation wasn't motivated by abstract altruism, but by recognition of mutual dependence and shared interest in maintaining relationships that benefited everyone involved. Hoffman checked his watch with obvious impatience. "I don't want to rush important decisions," he said, in a tone that clearly indicated he did want exactly that. "But time constraints are real. Mountain Vista has other properties to evaluate if this opportunity doesn't work out." The pressure tactic forced the moment of decision that had been building throughout the morning's discussions. Tom and Janet would have to choose between accepting immediate financial resolution through the buyout or committing to months of construction coordination with community support. Marcus watched their faces as they weighed competing considerations. Financial security against community continuity, guaranteed outcomes against collaborative uncertainty, individual independence against mutual dependence. The choice would define not just their future, but the kind of people they understood themselves to be. "Could we have a few minutes to discuss this privately?" Janet asked. Hoffman nodded curtly. "Of course. We'll wait outside." As the developer and his attorney stepped onto the sawmill's loading dock, Tom and Janet moved to a corner of the building for quiet conversation. The neighbors respected their privacy, but the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine whether months of community organizing had been worthwhile or simply an elaborate exercise in good intentions. Marcus found himself studying the faces of his neighbors. Anna's determined optimism, Bill's quiet confidence, the Hendersons' military bearing, the Wrights' idealistic hopefulness, Jake's weathered patience. Each had contributed time, research, and resource commitments based on faith that community cooperation could provide practical alternatives to commercial solutions. If Tom and Janet chose Hoffman's buyout, that faith would be tested in ways that might discourage future community efforts. If they chose to work with neighbors, it would validate an approach to problem-solving that could strengthen the entire mountain community. Through the window, Marcus could see Hoffman pacing impatiently on the loading dock, occasionally checking his phone and glancing at his watch. The developer's body language conveyed confidence that time pressure would ultimately favor his position, that the complexity of community alternatives would prove overwhelming when people faced actual decision points. After 10 minutes that felt much longer, Tom and Janet returned to the main group. Their expressions were composed but revealed nothing about their decision. "We've made our choice," Tom announced, his voice steady despite the obvious weight of the moment. The room fell silent as everyone waited to learn whether community cooperation had proved sufficient to compete with commercial convenience, whether neighbors' good intentions could translate into practical solutions that people were actually willing to accept. "We're staying," Tom said simply, his words cutting through the tension that had filled Anna's sawmill. "We're accepting the community's offer and working with our neighbors to rebuild." The silence that followed lasted only seconds before erupting into expressions of relief and excitement from the assembled neighbors. Anna Kowalski smiled broadly, Bill Morrison nodded with quiet satisfaction, and the Hendersons exchanged glances that communicated their approval of the decision. Even Jake, Martinez, usually economical with expressions of emotion, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Marcus felt something profound shift within his chest, a release of tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying, mixed with an unfamiliar sense of collective accomplishment. For the first time in his adult life, he had been part of something larger than his individual efforts, and that something had succeeded in ways that transcended any single person's capabilities. Craig Hoffman's reaction was immediate and predictable. "I think you're making a mistake," he said, his professional courtesy unable to completely mask his frustration at losing what he had clearly considered a certain deal. "But the offer stands until 5 o'clock today if you reconsider." His attorney gathered documents with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to deals that didn't close, as expected. "Mr. and Mrs. McReynolds, you should understand that construction projects of this scope often encounter unforeseen complications that can substantially increase costs and extend timelines." The warning was delivered as legal advice, but everyone in the room recognized it as a final attempt to create doubt about the community alternative. Tom and Janet, however, seemed settled in their decision. "We understand the risks," Janet replied, "but we also understand the value of being part of a community that works together to solve problems. That's worth more to us than financial guarantees." After Hoffman and his attorney departed, the neighbors spent the remainder of the morning transforming research and planning into concrete action steps. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Where earlier discussions had been theoretical, now every conversation focused on practical implementation of specific tasks. Bill Morrison produced survey maps of his property and worked with Tom and Janet to identify the optimal building site. The location they selected offered spectacular mountain views, while being protected from the wind patterns that had contributed to the original fire. Existing utility lines ran within 200 yards of the site, minimizing connection costs. The Hendersons took responsibility for coordinating the permit application process, using their military logistics experience to navigate county bureaucracy efficiently. Maria had already contacted the building department and understood exactly which documents were required and in what sequence they needed to be submitted. Anna began calculating lumber requirements and costs, working from building plans that balanced the McReynolds' space needs with their budget constraints. The modular construction approach would allow much of the framing to be done off-site during winter months, with final assembly taking place when spring weather permitted outdoor work. The Wrights focused on sustainable building features that would reduce long-term operating costs. Solar water heating, rainwater collection systems, passive heating design that maximized southern exposure while minimizing northern windows. Their environmental expertise would save the McReynolds hundreds of dollars annually in utility costs. Jake Martinez began planning electrical and plumbing installations that met current codes while remaining within the project budget. His decades of construction experience proved invaluable in identifying cost-effective solutions that novice builders would never have considered. As Marcus observed the coordinated activity, he realized that his role was evolving from organizer to participant. In a process that had developed its own momentum, each neighbor contributed expertise in areas where they were qualified, and the collective knowledge of the group far exceeded what any individual could have provided. "What about you, Marcus?" Tom asked during a brief lull in the planning discussions. "What's your role in all this?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He had been so focused on coordinating others' contributions that he hadn't considered his own specific role in the construction process. His watchmaking skills seemed irrelevant to building houses, and his 15 years of isolation hadn't prepared him for construction work. "I'm not sure I have construction skills that would be useful," Marcus admitted. Anna looked up from her lumber calculations. You have the most important skill of all, the ability to coordinate complex projects that require precision and attention. To detail, she gestured at the various planning documents spread across work tables. This project needs someone to track timelines, coordinate deliveries, ensure that different work phases happen in proper sequence. That's exactly the kind of systematic thinking you use in your watch repair work. The parallel hadn't occurred to Marcus, but as Anna explained the construction coordination requirements, he began to see connections between timepiece restoration and project management. Both required understanding how individual components related to larger systems. Both demanded careful sequencing of work phases. Both succeeded or failed based on attention to precise details. Project manager, Robert Henderson confirmed. Essential role in any complex construction effort. Someone who understands the big picture while tracking all the small pieces. Over the following weeks, Marcus discovered that managing a community construction project was indeed similar to restoring complex timepieces, but with the added challenge that the components were people rather than mechanical parts. Coordinating delivery schedules, work crews, permit inspections, and material supplies required the same systematic thinking he brought to clockwork, but with much greater tolerance for unpredictability and human variability. The permit approval process took longer than expected, delayed by county requirements for environmental impact assessments and septic system modifications. But rather than derailing the project, the delays allowed time for more thorough planning and resource accumulation. Anna used the extra time to season lumber properly, ensuring that dimensional stability would prevent future structural problems. The Hendersons refined construction plans based on updated building codes and refined cost estimates. The Wrights researched additional sustainable building techniques that could be incorporated without exceeding budget constraints. Winter provided an unexpected advantage for the community project. Rather than halting work entirely, the season allowed indoor preparation activities that advanced the project significantly. Anna's sawmill became a staging area where framing components were cut, fitted, and prepared for rapid assembly once spring weather arrived. Marcus found his cabin transformed into project headquarters with construction schedules, supplier contact information, and coordination materials occupying the same spaces that had previously been reserved for timepiece repair. The solitude he had protected for 15 years now accommodated regular meetings, planning sessions, and coordination calls that connected him daily with neighbors throughout the valley. The change might have felt invasive, but Marcus discovered that purposeful activity shared with capable people was fundamentally different from the social complications he had spent years avoiding. Community cooperation focused on practical problem-solving rather than emotional complexity, and everyone's contributions were evaluated based on effectiveness rather than personality compatibility. Tom and Janet spent the winter months living in Bill Morrison's renovated ranger station, but they were far from idle. Both threw themselves into learning construction skills through online courses, books, and hands-on practice sessions in Anna's workshop. Their teaching backgrounds proved valuable in organizing information and developing systematic approaches to new skills. By March, when weather conditions began to permit outdoor work, Tom could operate power tools competently, and Janet had become proficient in Finnish carpentry techniques. Their transformation from disaster victims to active construction participants embodied the community cooperation principle that everyone contributed according to their developing abilities. The house raising that took place on the first warm weekend in April became a celebration that extended far beyond the original group of neighbors. Word of the community project had spread throughout the mountain valley. attracting additional volunteers who wanted to participate in what many saw as a model for how rural communities could support their members. Marcus arrived at the building, site before dawn, to find more than 20 people already assembled, including several families he had never met. Coffee and breakfast were being prepared over camp stoves, tools were being organized into workstations, and the foundation that had been poured the previous week was ready to receive framing components that had been precisely cut and fitted. During winter months, the coordinated construction effort that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Framing walls that would have taken professional contractors several days to complete were raised in a single morning through the coordinated efforts of multiple work crews. Electrical and plumbing rough-ins that typically required weeks of scheduling were completed in parallel by teams working in different areas of the structure. By sunset, the house had progressed from foundation to weatherproof shell, with roof sheathing complete and windows installed. The transformation was dramatic enough that several volunteers took photographs to document what could be accomplished through community cooperation. "Never seen anything like it," commented Sarah Chen, a newcomer to the valley who had heard about the project through word-of-mouth networks. "Where I come from, construction projects involve hiring contractors and waiting months for completion. This community approach gets more done in a day than most projects accomplish in weeks." Her observation highlighted something important about the community construction method. While it required extensive coordination and relied on volunteer labor, it could achieve results that were both faster and less expensive than conventional construction approaches. The success of the house raising attracted attention from outside the immediate community. A reporter from the regional newspaper wrote a feature article about the project, and a local television station produced a segment about community cooperation in rural areas. The coverage brought additional volunteers and resources, but it also brought something less welcome: inquiries from developers interested in replicating the community approach for commercial purposes. Had 3 different companies called this week, Anna reported during a coordination meeting in Marcus's kitchen, all wanting to know if we'd be willing to organize community construction projects for vacation rental developments. The inquiries revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had motivated the neighbors' efforts. Community cooperation had emerged from genuine relationships and shared commitment to mutual support. It couldn't be replicated as a commercial service without losing the essential characteristics that made it effective. "We're helping Tom and Janet because they're our neighbors," Bill Morrison said simply. "Not because we're running a construction business." The distinction was important, and it helped clarify the boundaries and purposes of community cooperation. The neighbors were willing to organize similar efforts for other community members who faced genuine emergencies, but they weren't interested in commercializing their collaborative capabilities. By late spring, the McReynolds house was complete and occupied. The final structure was smaller than their original home, but incorporated design features that made it more energy efficient, weather-resistant, and suited to mountain living. Solar water heating reduced utility costs, passive solar design minimized heating requirements, and rainwater collection provided irrigation for Janet's expanded vegetable garden. The housewarming party that celebrated the project's completion brought together everyone who had contributed to the effort, creating the largest gathering in the valley's recent history. Marcus found himself in the unfamiliar position of being recognized as the person whose initial organizing had made the entire project possible. "You started something important," Tom said during the evening's informal speeches. "Not just for Janet and me, but for everyone who learned that neighbors really can solve problems together when they're willing to coordinate their efforts." The recognition was gratifying, but Marcus understood that the project's success had depended on contributions from many people rather than leadership from any single individual. Community cooperation worked precisely because it distributed responsibilities and utilized everyone's capabilities rather than depending on exceptional individual effort. As summer progressed, the community coordination networks that had developed during the construction project found new applications. When the Wrights' greenhouse was damaged by hail, the same group of neighbors organized repair efforts. When Jake Martinez needed help with equipment maintenance at his property, volunteers provided labor in exchange for his instruction in electrical systems. The pattern of mutual support that had emerged from the McReynolds crisis had become a permanent feature of Mountain Valley life. People still maintained their individual properties and privacy, but they also recognized their interdependence and willingness to coordinate resources when circumstances required collective action. Marcus' own transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. His cabin remained a place of solitude and precision work, but it was no longer isolated from community life. The coordination skills he had developed during the construction project made him a natural focal point for organizing other collaborative efforts. When county officials proposed changes to zoning regulations that would have restricted rural property use, Marcus coordinated the community's response to public hearings. When wildfire risk increased during drought conditions, he helped organize neighborhood fire prevention activities. When winter storms damaged utility services, he coordinated mutual aid efforts that enabled everyone to maintain essential services through temporary resource sharing. The role suited him in ways he had never anticipated. Community coordination utilized his systematic thinking and attention to detail while allowing him to maintain the independence and privacy that remained important to his well-being. He could contribute to collective efforts without sacrificing the solitary satisfaction he drew from precision work in his shop. 1 year after the original fire, Marcus stood on the porch of his cabin, watching evening light fade across the mountain landscape. Scattered throughout the valley, lights were beginning to appear in windows of neighbors he now knew by name and character. The community that had seemed invisible during his 15 years of isolation had revealed itself as a network of capable, generous people who supported each other while maintaining their individual independence. The railroad watch he had been repairing when Tom and Janet's house burned sat on his workbench, its mechanism keeping perfect time. But the precision work that had once provided his primary satisfaction now felt like one component of a larger life that included community relationships and collaborative responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges that might require coordinated community response. Marcus no longer approached such possibilities with apprehension, but with confidence in the problem-solving capabilities that neighbors could achieve when they worked together. His journey from isolation to community involvement had begun with a house fire that destroyed his neighbor's home. It had concluded with the understanding that the most important structures people built weren't houses, but relationships, networks of mutual support that could survive any individual disaster and provide resources for rebuilding whatever was lost. The mountain valley was still remote, still demanding, still beautiful in ways that were challenged and rewarded in equal measure. But it was no longer a place where people faced those challenges alone. Community cooperation had transformed it into something rarer and more valuable, a place where neighbors meant exactly what Tom McReynolds had said during those first difficult days. Good people within shouting distance, ready to help when help was needed. A's autumn arrived 2 years after the fire. Marcus received a phone call that would test the community's commitment to mutual support in ways none of them had anticipated. The caller was Rebecca Martinez, Jake's granddaughter, calling from Phoenix with news that her grandfather had suffered a stroke and would require extended medical care in the city. He keeps talking about his bus, his workshop, his mountain home. Rebecca explained, her voice strained with worry. The doctors say he'll need months of rehabilitation, maybe longer, but he's terrified that everything he's built up there will be lost or vandalized while he's gone. Marcus understood Jake's concern immediately. The converted school bus that served as Jake's home was weatherproofed and secure, but it contained decades of accumulated tools, personal possessions, and mechanical equipment that represented both his livelihood and his life's work. Leaving it unattended for months would expose it to theft, weather damage, or simple deterioration from lack of maintenance. "What can we do to help?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer would require another community coordination effort. "I was hoping. I know it's a lot to ask, but could someone keep an eye on his place? Maybe check on it regularly. Maintain the equipment, make sure everything stays secure." The request was reasonable, but complicated. Jake's property was remote, even by mountain standards, accessible only by a rough track that became impassable during winter months. Regular maintenance would require someone with mechanical skills and willingness to make frequent trips to an isolated location. Marcus organized a meeting at Anna's sawmill the following Saturday. The same neighbors who had coordinated Tom and Janet's rebuilding project gathered to discuss how they might help Jake Martinez during his medical crisis. But the situation was different from the house fire. This wasn't about building something new, but about maintaining something existing, protecting resources rather than creating them. Jake's been part of this community for over 20 years. Bill Morrison said after Marcus explained the situation. "Helped every one of us with electrical problems, equipment repairs, project coordination. Time to return that support." The sentiment was unanimous, but the practical challenges were significant. Jake's property was 40 minutes from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles during good weather and completely isolated during winter storms. Maintaining his workshop and equipment would require technical knowledge that not everyone possessed. "I could take primary responsibility," Carl Wright volunteered. "My farm's closest to Jake's place, and I have the mechanical background to maintain his equipment properly." Susan Wright nodded agreement. "We've been thinking about expanding our operation anyway. Jake's property has good soil and southern exposure that would work well for season extension greenhouses." The suggestion revealed an elegant solution that benefited everyone involved. The Wrights could use Jake's land for agricultural expansion while providing the property maintenance and security Jake needed. Their farming activities would keep the property occupied and functional without interfering with Jake's eventual return. "Would that be caretaking or land sharing?" Maria Henderson asked, raising an important question about the legal and financial structure of such an arrangement. The discussion that followed explored various models for temporary property. Stewardship. Jake's situation differed from the McReynolds fire because it involved maintaining existing resources rather than creating new ones, and because it was temporary rather than permanent. Anna Kowalski suggested a hybrid approach that combined property, caretaking with resource sharing. The Wrights would maintain Jake's workshop and equipment in exchange for using his land for agricultural expansion. All the neighbors would provide specialized maintenance services, Bill Morrison handling any structural repairs, Marcus coordinating supply deliveries and correspondence, the Hendersons managing any bureaucratic requirements. Jake gets professional property management without paying management fees, Anna summarized. The Wrights get land access for agricultural expansion. The rest of us get to contribute skills we can spare while maintaining a neighbor's property for his return. The arrangement required careful legal documentation to protect everyone's interests. Jake needed assurance that his property would be maintained properly and returned to him in good condition. The Wrights needed use agreements that justified their investment in improvements. Other neighbors needed liability protection for their Maintenance activities. Robert Henderson, drawing on his military experience with logistics agreements, coordinated the legal documentation process. The resulting agreements were more complex than the land-sharing arrangements that had helped the McReynolds, but they provided a clear definition of responsibilities, compensation, and termination conditions. Marcus found himself serving as liaison between Jake in Phoenix and the mountain community managing his property. Weekly phone calls kept Jake informed about maintenance activities, equipment status, and any issues requiring his guidance. The conversations revealed aspects of Jake's knowledge and experience that hadn't been apparent during casual neighborhood interactions. "That old compressor in the workshop sounds like it's running rough," Jake said during one November call. "Carl should check the oil level and clean the air filter. There's a maintenance log in the blue binder on the shelf above the workbench." His detailed knowledge of every piece of equipment, every maintenance requirement, every seasonal preparation task demonstrated the depth of expertise that the community was working to preserve. Jake's workshop wasn't just a collection of tools, but an integrated system that required informed management. The winter months tested the community's commitment to Jake's property maintenance. Heavy snows made access difficult, and several pieces of equipment required repairs that pushed Carlwright's mechanical abilities to their limits. But rather than abandoning the effort, neighbors coordinated resources to address each challenge as it arose. When Jake's backup generator failed during a January blizzard, Anna's sawmill provided a replacement unit. When high winds damaged the workshop's roof, the Hendersons organized a repair crew that worked between storms to prevent water damage. When thieves attempted to break into Jake's bus, Bill Morrison installed additional security measures and coordinated regular patrol visits. Each challenge required coordination among multiple neighbors, but the community had developed systems for rapid response to emergencies. The communication networks and resource-sharing arrangements that had emerged during the McReynolds rebuilding project now served to protect Jake's property during his absence. Spring brought encouraging news from Phoenix. Jake's rehabilitation was progressing ahead of schedule, and doctors were optimistic about his eventual return to independent living. But the timeline remained uncertain, and Jake's age meant that full recovery might take longer than initially hoped. "I never expected to be away this long," Jake confided during a March phone call with Marcus. "Rebecca keeps suggesting I should sell the mountain property and stay in Phoenix permanently. Says it would be safer, more convenient for medical care." The suggestion troubled Marcus more than he had expected. Jake Martinez had been part of the mountain community longer than anyone except Bill Morrison. His workshop, his expertise, his quiet presence at community gatherings, all had become integral to the valley's character. Losing Jake permanently would diminish the community in ways that went beyond practical considerations. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I want to come home," he said finally. "This place is beautiful. Rebecca's family is wonderful. But it's not my home. Home is that old bus, that workshop, those mountains, neighbors who understand that sometimes a man needs quiet more than conversation." His words resonated with Marcus's own experience of finding home in the mountain community. The relationships weren't based on constant social interaction, but on mutual understanding, shared values, and willingness to provide support when circumstances required it. "Then we'll keep everything ready for your return," Marcus assured him. "However long it takes." Jake's eventual return in late summer was celebrated with a community gathering that rivaled the McReynolds housewarming party. His property had been maintained so carefully that he found it in better condition than when he had left. Equipment serviced and updated, workshop organized more efficiently, even some improvements he hadn't anticipated. Carl installed solar panels on the bus, Jake announced during the welcome home party, his voice carrying amazement at the discovery. The system's designed so I can run the workshop tools off solar power during daylight hours. Been wanting to do that for years, but never got around to it. The improvement was typical of the care the community had provided. Rather than simply maintaining Jake's property, they had enhanced it in ways that reflected understanding of his needs and interests. The right's agricultural use of his land had improved soil condition and established irrigation systems that would benefit future uses. Marcus reflected on how the community's response to Jake's medical crisis had differed from their response to the McReynolds fire. Both situations had required coordinated community effort, but Jake's absence had demanded sustained, long-term commitment rather than intensive, short-term action. The experience had demonstrated that community cooperation could adapt to different types of challenges. Crisis response was one model, rapid mobilization of resources to address immediate emergencies. Stewardship was another model, sustained commitment to maintaining resources and relationships over extended periods. As the third anniversary of Tom and Janet's fire approached, Marcus began receiving inquiries from other rural communities interested in learning about their coordination methods. A university researcher studying rural resilience wanted to document their community cooperation strategies. A non-profit organization focused on disaster response sought advice about organizing neighbor-to-neighbor support networks. The attention was gratifying but also concerning. Marcus worried that external interest might change the essential characteristics that made their community cooperation effective. Genuine mutual support emerged from actual relationships and shared commitment to place. It couldn't be replicated through policy guidelines or organizational structures imposed from outside. "We're not running a program," Anna said, when Marcus shared his concerns about the increasing external attention. "We're just neighbors helping neighbors when help is needed." Her comment crystallized Marcus's understanding of what made their community cooperation sustainable. It wasn't a system or methodology that could be exported to other locations. It was a set of relationships that had developed organically among people who had chosen to build lives in a challenging but rewarding place. The winter following Jake's return brought the community's most severe test yet. A late-season blizzard, combined with equipment failures to create power outages that lasted nearly 2 weeks. The storm was too severe for individual households to manage alone, but it also isolated the valley from outside assistance. Marcus found his cabin becoming an informal coordination center as neighbors organized resource sharing that enabled everyone to maintain heat, food preparation, and communication throughout the extended outage. Solar panels, wood stoves, generators, and stored supplies were distributed according to need rather than ownership, with careful record-keeping to ensure fair compensation once normal conditions returned. The experience reinforced lessons that had emerged from previous community challenges. Mutual support worked because it was based on relationships of trust and reciprocity that had been built through smaller, less dramatic interactions over time. Crisis response was possible because the community had already established patterns of coordination and resource sharing. As spring arrived and normal routines resumed, Marcus realized that his personal transformation was complete but ongoing. The isolation that had once defined his life had evolved into something more complex, chosen solitude balanced with purposeful community engagement, individual independence enhanced rather than compromised by mutual dependence. His workshop remained a place of precision and quiet concentration. The timepieces he repaired still demanded the same systematic attention to detail that had provided satisfaction for 20 years. But that individual excellence now existed within a context of community relationships that gave his skills broader meaning and application. Standing on his porch as another mountain evening settled over the valley, Marcus counted the lights appearing in windows throughout the community. Each light represented a household, a family or individual who had chosen mountain living despite its challenges. Collectively, they represented something rarer, a community that had learned to balance independence with interdependence, privacy with mutual support, individual achievement with collective capability. The transformation that had begun with Tom and Janet's fire had become a permanent feature of valley life. Not because anyone had planned or mandated it, but because neighbors had discovered that cooperation enhanced rather than compromised their individual capacity to thrive in challenging circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as tomorrow always did in the mountains. But Marcus no longer faced those challenges with the isolation that had once seemed necessary for peace and independence. He faced them as part of a community that had learned to say, with genuine meaning, "Welcome to the family." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.